Of the DeKalb County Historical Genealogical Society. I'm Marcia Wilson, the current president, in case I don't know you. Certainly glad to see everybody here tonight on Veterans Day for this really special program. And if we have any veterans out there who are with us tonight, thank you for your service, and we honor you today. We want to thank, too, the DeKalb County History Center for providing our event space tonight, and for getting through all the technology that we needed to put this together, both virtually and in person. We're going to dispense again with the business meeting of the program and just have our program tonight. Although I will remind you that if any of you are overdue on your membership, and you can check your last corn silk label to see when your dues are due. Get those in before the next corn silk goes out, which will be next month, because we'll be purging our membership list and you won't get the next issue if your dues aren't up to date. Certainly feel free to contact me. My email address is in corn silk if you have any questions. Also, this is the last program of our year. Normally, we take the winter off and then we come back in March. We'll just wait and see what's happening nationwide in March and make our plans accordingly. And now I'm going to introduce the program tonight, which is DeKalb County Women in World War II. World War II was the first time women were allowed to enlist in the U.S. military. Over 350,000 women nationwide enlisted to release a man to fight and to fill essential positions statewide. The presenter's grandmother, Millie Kaiser, was one of about 140 women in DeKalb County who joined the military during this time. Countless others served their country on the home front as cadet nurses, Red Cross volunteers, WASP members, or factory workers. This program will highlight the stories of these DeKalb County women. Eva Johnson, our presenter, is a local history and genealogy librarian in the Chicagoland area and has been researching her family history since she was 10 years old. Her interest in World War II began while talking to her grandmother, who joined the Waves in 1944. Eva writes about family history and local history in her blog, The Family History Librarian. During or after Eva's presentation, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat area of your screen. Your comments and questions will be monitored so that Eva can respond. Tonight's program is being videotaped and will be available for a month after this program on the DeKalb County History Center website, dekalbcountyhistory.org. And of course, then it's available to the public. So feel free to tell your friends and family about the program and they can catch it that way. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Eva Johnson.
Hi, thank you for coming today. Like Marcia said, my topic today is about DeKalb County women of World War II. And it was fitting that today's meeting happened to be on Veterans Day so that we could recognize these local women and share their stories that have sometimes been overshadowed or forgotten. So I wanted to start with my grandmother's story. So like Marcia mentioned, my grandmother was Millie Kaiser. She lived in DeKalb for her whole life up to that point. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, she was a senior in high school at DeKalb Township High School. And so it was a very important part of her young life. And when she graduated the next year in June, she got a job at Wurlitzer And you may know that Wurlitzer during the war had converted their piano factory to making parts for planes. And so when she got a job there, she was a glueman, and her job was to glue the pieces of the wooden propeller together. And yeah, so that it was nice and sturdy. And because Wurlitzer was partnering with the Navy to make these planes, there were a lot of Navy recruiters and that were coming through and trying to recruit people from the factory to join the Navy. And she mentioned seeing posters around. And one of the times when one of the recruiters was in the factory, was talking to my grandmother, and she decided to join the Waves. So in the summer of 1944, she enlisted in the Navy Waves and did basic training. She was sent to Hunter College in the Bronx, New York, and did basic training there for several weeks, and then was stationed at Sofley Field in Pensacola, Florida. In the lower right picture on the screen, you'll see some airplanes that were at Sofley Field. So her job was to sit and watch the airplanes come in and out of the field, and she registered the numbers that were on the plane, and each plane corresponded with a pilot. And she kept track of how many flight hours each pilot and each plane had, because they had to reach a certain number of flight hours before they could be ready to be stationed wherever they were going to be sent. So that was a small job, but a very important job to make sure that all of the pilots were properly trained before they left for overseas. She did meet many young women who were like her and became good friends with several of them. So you see in the picture on the top right, two of her lifelong friends that she became very close with. And they were friends for their whole lives. And so her story was very important to her and to our family. And it really got me interested in how many other women from the area had stories just like hers. How many women enlisted in the Waves from DeKalb County? How many other women, you know, joined the military and answered the call to help Uncle Sam? So last summer, I decided to answer that question and started researching other women who were like my grandmother. So I looked around in digitized newspapers. I came over to the Joiner History Room to do some research. I visited area libraries and historical societies, and went on Ancestry to find more demographic information and more biographical information about them. And what I found so far was about 140 women from DeKalb County, who lived in DeKalb County at the time or were from DeKalb County at the time, enlisted in the military. So there was a strong Navy presence in the area. So a lot of these women joined the Navy. Nationwide, most women joined the Army. So that was kind of unusual that more women joined the Navy from DeKalb County than the Army. 46 women joined the Army. 30 women joined either the Army Nurse Corps or the Navy Nurse Corps, the majority of them in the Army Nurse Corps. 6 women in the Marines, and 1 woman joined the Coast Guard SPARS. And when I was researching these women and their stories and learning about what they did, I realized that a lot of them, before enlisting in the military, were also serving in various capacities locally before they decided to join the military. So like my grandmother, she worked in a factory in a war job. And so there were a lot of women who, for one reason or another, couldn't enlist in the military, but stayed local and worked in the factories, worked in agriculture, worked in business, or they served and volunteered in public service organizations like the Red Cross, the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol, or the Cadet Nurse Corps, or volunteer nurses' aides. So there were a lot of other ways that a woman could serve besides enlisting in the military. And I did want to read to you this article that appeared in the Daily Chronicle in February of 1943. I just want to read this to you because it's a very good summary of what was going on at the time, and it gives a little bit of appreciation, which is nice to see, to the women of Sycamore. So it says, Sycamore women are taking up the call to arms as the report was made yesterday that 3 more of the city's women have enlisted in some branch of the service and are now awaiting call. The latest girls of Sycamore who feel they will be able to do more for their country by enlisting in one of the branches of Women's Corps include Mrs. Agnes Henderson, who will serve with the Army and therefore has enlisted in the WWII. Naomi Barnes prefers the Navy and she will take up with the Waves. Irene Lally recently announced she had enlisted in the Waves and, like the others, is awaiting call. Most of the new enlistees expect to be called sometime this month or early in March. Other Sycamore girls who are in the service now include Esther Mae Nesbitt, who is with the WWII at Daytona Beach, Florida, Lieutenant Marjorie Smith, former DeKalb County tuberculosis nurse who is in charge of surgery at the base hospital at Camp Grant, Lieutenant Irene Blafus, who is an Army nurse at Bucklet Field, Denver, Colorado, Ruth Hall and Alta Wiley, both members of the Army Nursing Corps. In addition to these girls who are serving Uncle Sam and wearing a uniform, there are many others who are serving the country as well, but not required to wear a uniform. These are the members of the various Red Cross units and many other branches of the public service work that all sums up for Uncle Sam. So this was just a nice summary of the various ways that women from Sycamore in particular were serving their country. So today I'm going to introduce you to just a few of those stories and some of those women. I wish I had time to talk about all of them, but I don't, so you just get a highlight today. I wanted to start with the women of the WWII. So the WWII, which is Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, was established on May 14th, 1942, and then the following year they dropped the auxiliary. So you may see it with 2 A's and you may see it with 1 A. So the first year they had the 2 A's in it. So the Women's Army Corps is what it became. And nationwide, over 150,000 women joined the WWII. And like I mentioned before, 46 of them were from DeKalb County. And in all the branches of the military, women were enlisted into the military to serve in support positions to so-called release a man to fight, so that they would be stationed stateside or in different base camps or in different positions, and that would allow a man who normally had that job to go and fight on the front lines. So that was the idea behind all of these. And DeKalb County WWII women, served in a lot of different positions and a lot of different roles. Some of them include stenographers, clerks, photographers, weather observers, recruiters, and all kinds of specialists. So they had a lot of different positions. And some branches sent women overseas to be stationed, and the WWII was one of those branches that sent women to be stationed overseas. So some of these women did serve abroad. And here on the screen, you have several firsts from DeKalb County. So Esther Mae Nesbitt was an artist from Sycamore, and she first joined the Civil Air Patrol in Chicago and then decided to enlist in the Army. And she was actually the first DeKalb County woman and the first Sycamore woman to enlist in the military. She became a master sergeant and she was assigned to forward communications and was one of the first WWIIs to land on Omaha Beach in France in July of 1944. And she served as a map custodian in the European War Room in France and ended up earning a French Croix de Gras, very important medal for her service as a map custodian. And she's probably the most well-known female veteran of World War II from DeKalb County. She also continued to serve during the Korean War, so her military career did not end in World War II. And that's a lot like a lot of DeKalb County women were in the same position. They decided to continue their military career through the following wars. The second woman from DeKalb County was Marion Cook Holmes, and she enlisted just 2 days after Master Sergeant Esther Nesbitt. She was a recruiter in the Chicago area for much of the war. And the first African-American woman from DeKalb County to enlist was Sergeant Maddie Jackson of Sycamore. And in the course of the war, she earned the rank of tech sergeant, and she was stationed in England and France. And it seems like the many branches, especially the WWII and the WAVES, seem to attract family groups. So there were several groups of family members who would join together. One of those groups was the Villegas sisters of Sycamore. They joined the WWII together, and that would be Linda, Felicitas, and Theofila. They joined the WWII together in 1943, I believe. And another pair was the mother-daughter Mary Catherine and Mary Louise Burkhart of Sycamore. They joined the WWII at the same time. Corporal Evelyn Anderson was in the first WWII company to be sent to the Pacific Theater, and she was stationed as a stenographer at the headquarters Pacific Wing Air Transport Command in Honolulu. And she had previously worked at DeKalb Ag Association, I believe as a secretary, and she had worked at DeKalb Ag with Donna Harris. So Donna Harris decided to join the WWII also, and she was an amateur photographer before enlisting. And so after she enlisted, she became a photographer for the Signal Corps. And she was one of several women who were photographers in the WWII who were from DeKalb County. And lastly on this screen, we have Sergeant Marguerite Kernal of DeKalb. She joined the WWII and was stationed overseas in Europe. And she operated a radio broadcasting studio in Algiers. And then when she was stationed in Italy, she taught French to her colleagues while stationed there. So she was another woman of many talents. And my grandma was one of the women from DeKalb County who had served in the WAVES. The WAVES stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. And this was established just a few months after the Women's Army Corps. So this was established in July of 1942. There were 86,000 women from across the US who enlisted in the WAVES, and 56 women of those were from DeKalb County. Most of them did basic training at Hunter College in the Bronx, and then were stationed primarily across the US. They were not sent overseas except for Hawaii. So one of the women who was stationed in Hawaii was Ella Barnes. You can see her in the picture on the left, and she's on the right of that picture. She was the aviation machinist mate first class, and she was from Sycamore. And at the time, she was one of just a few Illinois women stationed there. Later on, Mary Coseras from DeKalb was also an aviation machinist mate. She was stationed in Texas, Oklahoma, and then later in Hawaii in an assembly and repair department. Violet Eastwood was from DeKalb, and she worked with my grandma at Wurlitzer before enlisting, and she was also a member of the WASP before enlisting, and I'll get to what the WASP organization was later. After enlisting, she became a pharmacist mate, and she was stationed in Idaho, and her sister Daisy, a couple years later, also joined the WAVES. And Wilma Swanson was from Sycamore, and she was reported to be the first local woman to be commissioned as an ensign in August of 1944. And after being commissioned as an officer, she was stationed in Washington, D.C. as a communications officer. And many women, whether just before enlisting in the military or while they were enlisted, ended up meeting their husbands. And one of those women who had a husband also serving in the war was pharmacist mate third class Edith Larson. And she's shown here in a picture with her husband, Lieutenant James Larson. And there were many women who decided to enlist in the military because there was a family member that was already enlisted, a cousin or a brother or a sister or someone they knew, and that influenced their decision. So for example, my grandmother, her cousin was a man, and he joined the Navy a few months before she did. And also her father was in World War I. So you'll find that a lot of these women had fathers or uncles that also had served in the military at one point in time. So next I want to talk about the Nurses Corps. Most of the women from DeKalb County were in the Army Nurse Corps, and a few of them were in the Navy Nurse Corps. And when the U.S. was brought into World War II, both the Navy and the Army had a severe shortage of nurses. So they quickly recruited a lot of registered nurses who were already trained as nurses into the military. And that created a really big nurse shortage for civilian hospitals, which I'll get to in a little while. But they recruited a lot of these women into the either Army or Navy, and they were not automatically considered enlisted members until much later. They were given retroactive veteran status. So their status during the war was a little bit in flux, but later on they were recognized as veterans. And many of these women were served overseas, toward the front lines. They would help with evacuating and tending to the wounded on the front lines. And the women who stayed stateside would work in different base hospitals or those kinds of things to tend to the wounded that were sent back to the States. So one of the women who were stationed overseas was Ensign Laura Evelyn Wolfe of DeKalb. She was stationed in England, in southern England, for 9 months. And she was there when D-Day happened. And so she attended to the wounded from the D-Day campaign. And she specialized in surgical and orthopedic work. And so she must have seen a lot of things during those days. Lieutenant Jean McQueen of Kirkland served in the South Pacific. She was with a medical evacuation transport squadron and aided in the evacuation of the wounded from the front lines there. And she was awarded the Air Medal for courageous service in aerial fighting in May of 1945. And her photo is in the middle of your screen, and I'm so sorry that it's such a dark picture, but it was what I could find. A lot of these pictures are from the newspaper, which had been digitized from microfilm, so sometimes it got very dark and are not always very clear. So I apologize for the darker pictures. And lastly on the screen is Lieutenant Marjorie Smith. She was mentioned in the article that I read to you at the beginning, and she was a tuberculosis nurse in DeKalb County. And like the article mentioned, she was in charge of surgery at the Army Base Hospital at Camp Grant, and then later she was stationed in England. So women of the Marines. So the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, just like the main unit of the Marines, was highly competitive. Only about 19,000 women were accepted into the Marines nationwide, and 6 of them that I know of were from DeKalb County. Most Marines work stateside, but some of them had volunteered to work overseas, which meant Hawaii at the time. So one of them that served in Hawaii was Sergeant Lynn Chilton. She was from Maple Park. She was stationed in Chicago in the recruiting and induction office, and then volunteered for overseas service. And she was actually in the first group of women Marines to serve in Hawaii. Staff Sergeant Verna Johnson was also from Maple Park, and she was stationed in Santa Ana, California. And then there's 2 more women Marines that I want to mention, and I unfortunately don't have photos of them, but one of them is Sergeant Alberta Wilson. She was from Waterman and was stationed at the Marine Air Station in North Carolina in aerology, where she studied weather patterns and those kinds of things. She assisted in drawing maps for forecasting, taking airway observations, drawing upper air maps, and all of those kinds of things. And Corporal Vivian Capel of Sycamore was a platoon leader for 25 women Marines and was among the first women Marines to arrive at Camp Pendleton in California. And she worked in the office of a post auditor. And finally, the SPARS, who were part of the Coast Guard, and 12,000 women nationwide served in the SPARS. And I only know of 1 woman so far who was from DeKalb County who served in the SPARS. She was Yeoman 2nd Class Barbara Johnson, and she was from Lee. She enlisted in 1944 and was stationed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at a recruiting office, and she also promoted bond sales. So you can see her in the picture on the right at a booth at a recruiting fair or something of that sort, to tell other women what the SPARs were all about and to try to convince them to enlist. And so like I mentioned before, when I was researching the stories of these women, I realized that a lot of them had started serving their communities and serving their country on the home front. And so I also wanted to recognize the women who were very committed to serving their country, but for one reason or another did not enlist in the military. And so there were a lot of ways on the home front that women could support the war effort. Like I mentioned before, so many of them worked in war jobs, either in agriculture, industry, in the factories, in different business roles. Even something like a telephone operator was considered a war job, and a lot of women filled these roles as the men were leaving to go to war. And a lot of local factories like Wurlitzer, Cyclone, Ideal Industries, Interstate, they were working on producing essential items for the war effort and enlisted the help of a lot of these women. There were some local reports that I found that said at least a third to a half of the workforce in certain industries were women. So they were a really large percentage of the workforce. And a lot of times women were taking care of the home, taking care of their family, working these war jobs, and some of them also found time to volunteer in various organizations. One of the most active and prominent wartime organizations in the county was the American Red Cross. They did a lot of things across the country, or across the country and the county. There were units in nearly every village or township in the county. The largest chapter was in Sycamore, and that was the DeKalb County chapter. And that kind of was the umbrella for all of the smaller units in all of these townships or towns throughout the county. And then DeKalb had a separate chapter, which it ran itself. And a lot of these women did all kinds of things. So they organized fundraisers, prepared bandage dressings, blood drives, knitting and sewing drives. They coordinated a junior Red Cross at the area schools, coordinated first aid and nursing courses, worked with the Office of Civilian Defense to coordinate volunteer nurses aides courses. And so they did all kinds of things and put in many, many hours. One newspaper article I saw said that the county chapter had more than 2,000 volunteers throughout the course of the year and had like a huge number of bandages. In this picture here on the left, there is a picture of the Sycamore group, and they're creating, they're wrapping the bandages and dressings that they're going to send to the military. And that year, which I believe is 1943, so far they had completed 176,400 dressings. So they really were working many hours and very committed to the war effort. And on the photo on the right is Mrs. Mary Marvin. She was the chairman of the sewing work for the DeKalb chapter, and each chapter had organized a sewing group and a knitting group, and they did all kinds of sewing, sewing shirts to send to men in uniform, knitting sweaters and scarves and hats to send to men in uniform, and also to like refugee camps and things like that. So their effort was felt worldwide. Their sweaters were sent everywhere. So there were a lot of very committed women of all ages who were helping through the American Red Cross. And one of the things that the American Red Cross did was help with the nursing shortage that I mentioned earlier. So as a lot of registered nurses were joining the nurse corps and leaving the local area hospitals had a really severe nursing shortage, and the nurses who were left didn't have time to take care of all the people who were in the hospitals. So one of the things that the Red Cross did was train a lot of volunteers to be nurses' aides and help out with a lot of the things that nurses needed help with. And they, like I mentioned, they worked with the Office of Civilian Defense to arrange these courses. And over the course of the whole war, there were over 100. There were over 100 local women who completed the course and were volunteering in area hospitals, primarily Glidden Hospital and St. Mary's Hospital. Those were the two that I found mentioned, but I'm sure there were other area hospitals that they volunteered in. And many of these women started out as volunteer nurses' aides, and some of them became professional nurses' aides and were hired permanently at the hospital. Some of them decided to become nurses through the Cadet Nurse Corps. Some of them decided to enlist in the military, and some of them were just committed to volunteer work and were volunteers in various capacities for the rest of their lives. So these women were also very committed to serving their community and serving their country. And one of the programs that the US government created to help address the severe nurse shortage was to create the Cadet Nursing Corps. So this program was to encourage young women to become nurses by giving them free tuition and free room and board for their nursing school. With the agreement that they would become active, they would stay active for 6 months after graduation, and they would be assigned either at civilian or military hospitals or other public health agencies. And so a lot of women were able to jumpstart their nursing careers through this program. It ran from July of 1943 to December of 1948, and nationwide more than 120,000 women had joined the Corps and completed the training. And then afterward, like I mentioned, they were stationed at civilian hospitals, or if they had graduated before the end of the war, they joined the Nurse Corps and served in the Army or the Navy. At least 64 of those women were from DeKalb County and were members of the Cadet Nurse Corps. And they trained and went through school at many hospitals in the Chicago and Rockford areas. And the program was very rigorous. I got an account from the family of WWII about what life was like through the program, and it sounded very intense. So they typically worked at least 8 hours a day and then were on call, sometimes longer than that, at the training hospital, attended classes during the day, and any extra free time. They did all their studying and tried to get some sleep. And so it was very intense. And student nurses were the majority of the workforce at many of these hospitals. So there was a lot of pressure on them to do well and to step up. And WWII is pictured here. She was from Mayfield, and she went through school at St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago and graduated in '46. Phyllis Rand, who's on the right, also studied at St. Luke's Hospital, and she graduated in '48. And Joyce Nelson was from DeKalb, and she was at Augustana Hospital of Nursing in Chicago and graduated in '47. And several cadets from DeKalb County, including Betty Craig, Doris Hagman, Janice Lindis, and Margaret Wadert, had joined the Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps after graduation. So there was a lot of overlap in some of these organizations. They started as volunteer nurse aide, joined the Nurse Corps or Cadet Nurse Corps, and then some of them moved on to the Army Nurse Corps. And the last group that I want to talk about today is the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol, or the WASPs. So I don't want you to confuse this with the other WASPs of World War II, which were the Women Air Force Service Pilots. So you may have heard of those WASPs, but these WASPs, the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol, worked locally and to prepare for defense in case they were ever needed or in case the U.S. was invaded. And the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol was first established by a group of women in Rockford in the spring of 1940. And then throughout the war and by the end of the war, there were many units that were established across the country. So I want to read to you an excerpt from a letter that Rockford Lieutenant Mary Trosper wrote to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt in February of 1941. She wrote, "We are preparing fervently for the time when we shall be called upon to defend America. These women were put through rigid courses of training in first aid, military drilling, auto mechanics, convoy transportation, and in some units, the use of firearms. Our ultimate aim is to interest every able-bodied woman to prepare systematically for the defense of America in the homes, in the schools, and in industries. Who can foresee what tasks will fall the lot of American women in the coming year? Whatever they be, the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol will be adequately prepared to fit snugly in the great wheel of national defense and will cooperate to the utmost in the organization and training of American women for American defense." And so, like her letter mentioned, these women were trained in all kinds of different things. They drilled and they marched. They were ready to drive any kind of vehicle. And also, what was unique to this group is they were also trained in mechanical instruction. So if the truck broke down or the ambulance broke down, they were able to, get out of the driver's seat, go to the engine and fix it, or go to the tire and change a tire. So they were prepared to also fix anything mechanically that went wrong with their vehicles. And the DeKalb group also did map reading. So if they were driving an ambulance somewhere, they were able to read a map and get there. And just were prepared for anything that they might be needed for. And luckily, they were not necessarily needed for any kind of major disaster in the area, but they were prepared for whatever came to them. So the unit for Sycamore, one of the units was actually started a few months after the one in Rockford. Some of the members of the Rockford unit, including Sally and Louise Doyle and Agnes Leary, came to Sycamore to try to start a Sycamore group in the fall of 1940. They had several meetings, but it never really reached full strength and there wasn't enough interest to keep it going. So they only met for a few months and then it kind of fizzled out. After the US entered World War II, interest in that kind of group rose again. And so Sally and Louise Doyle came back to Sycamore in February of 1942 to officially start up the Women's Ambulance Safety Patrol in DeKalb County again. And the DeKalb County unit was at that time the 18th unit in the nation. The group held meetings at the Eagle Club and they sometimes drilled at the high school. In November of 1943, they started drilling at the Armory building. And Jerry Newald, who is pictured here, was their captain for many of the active years. And many of the active years were through the end of the war. Their membership peaked at about 22 members in October of 1942. Many of their members were coming and going, and many of them started in the WASP and then decided that they wanted to join the military. And so they kind of lost a lot of members of the military because their members kept joining various branches of the military. Some of their members who left to join the military or nurse corps include Agnes Cleary, Violet Eastwood, Virginia Folsom, and Donna Harris. And so this was a really unique group that was unique to DeKalb County and unique in many respects to the nation. And they were very committed to serving their communities. And I also want to mention that a lot of women who were in the Ambulance Safety Patrol were also in other groups. So they also volunteered for the Red Cross, or they also were volunteer nurses' aides and were working in various capacities and were very committed to the war effort. So thank you very much for listening. And I also, anyone out there who is a veteran, I want to thank you for your service to the country. And I hope, like these women, that your stories are also heard. And I encourage you to tell your story to whoever wants to listen. And so thank you for listening to the stories of these women. You know, I feel like they are very groundbreaking. For the first time in the nation's history, they were able to enlist in the military as active members, and they left their homes, their family to serve their country. They served in a lot of various behind the scenes capabilities, And because a lot of their jobs were behind the scenes, both in the military and in the communities, they are not always recognized for their service. So I hope that this is one way to recognize them. One thing my Nana would say was, there's just a small thing to do for your country. And I want to remind you that it's not just a small thing, that it's a big thing, and that it's time that these women get the honor they deserve for their service. So thank you very much. And special thanks to the Joiner History Room, DeKalb County History Center, Kishwaukee Valley Heritage Society, the Regional History Center at NIU, Mary Rose Phillip, and Roger Keys. All of these different people and organizations helped with my research. And also there were various family members of these women who have shared their relative story with me, shared pictures, and so I appreciate those too. If you know of any women who had a unique story during World War II, I'd love to hear their story. Or if you want to learn more about women of DeKalb County, I do have a section of my website, which is thefamilyhistorylibrarian.com. There's a section for women of World War II, and you can read more stories and see more pictures, or you can contact me if you have a short story to share. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there's many questions, so I hope I can answer them. Okay. Let me turn on. How do I turn it on?
So if anyone has a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can just go ahead and ask.
Eva, it's Mary Rose. That was amazing. You had so many great stories.
Mary Rose,
and
we can't hear you.
Beautiful pictures.
Could you try saying that again, Mary Rose?
I'm sorry. I said your presentation was amazing. You had great stories and beautiful pictures. And you've really done a fine job honoring the women of DeKalb County. I'm very impressed. Thank you very much.
Were there any questions in the chat?
There's not a question I have one.
Okay.
So it's about Maddie Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know a lot about her family? The only reason I ask is for our next exhibit, we are researching Daniel Croswell, who was one of 9 African-American men that fought in World War I. And him and his wife didn't have any children, but they had their nieces live with them. And the last name is Jackson. So I'm just curious if there's a connection. Because you said there was like, oh, there's someone in the military, and then Daniel also fought in World War II.
Okay. Off the top of my head, I don't remember who her parents were or who she lived with or who her family members were, but I can look at my notes and see. But I do know she was from Sycamore, and like I have her married name and things like that. Which off the top of my head, I don't remember. But yeah, I can get that information to you. And for a lot of these women, what I've been able to find is just what has been in the newspaper or what I could find maybe on Ancestry.com or maybe in an obituary. So sometimes their story is a little incomplete, or as we know, sometimes the newspaper, you know, misspells a name or has the unit wrong. So I've done the best I can to get accurate information, but sometimes it's just not there. Which is why I'm hoping to reach out to some of the family members or someone who knew these women to get more information and get more a complete picture. And I do also want to mention that I have printed out some of the research that I have into a binder, which is here at the Joiner History Room and is available to look in. And there are more pictures and newspaper articles if you're interested in seeing that. So when you're able to come to the Joiner History Room again, it is here and available. Or I have a PDF of it as well. If people can't make it here, I can also send it to you in email.
EvaAnne, I'm aware of a Wave who is still alive living in DeKalb. I don't know where her hometown was. But you might be able to interview, she's quite mentally in good shape. You might be able to interview her to give you some insight. She was stationed in San Diego, but she went through that same training at Hunter College in New York.
Is that Katie Hyatt?
No, it's Carol Ann Dugan.
Okay.
Carol Dugan. I don't know if you're aware of her.
I didn't have her name yet.
She doesn't have a computer, but she has a phone and I have her address.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to talk with her and hear her story and see what she has to say. So I'd love to. And I do also want to note that that when I'm talking about them in this presentation and in my research, I use the name of whatever their name was when they were serving. So a lot of these women, I know them by their maiden names. And I've recorded their married names, but I recognize them most through their maiden names. But I'll double check. I may have her on the list already. But I'll double check. Thank you.
Yeah, her maiden, well, Richardson was her maiden name.
Okay.
Carol Maxine Richardson Dugan. She lives on Reserve Lane in DeKalb. Would you like her phone number? Maybe I should just put it in chat. I don't want to advertise.
Yeah, because it's being recorded, maybe send it to us some other way. You can maybe email it to Marcia or Michelle, and they can, or Michelle may have it already and can share it with me. So thank you. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for coming and for listening to this. And, you know, whether it's someone from World War II or any other war, if there's any veterans in your life, ask them about their story and listen to what they have to say, and thank them for their service. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva.